So if I'm going to use torpedo, for example, as my method to kill, then I need to be within launch parameters of the weapon, the submarine, and the fuel, right? And then once that happens, am I placed in the right place? Do I shoot? Then what comes next? Well, the enemy gets a boat. At some point, he may come back and he may want to do something to you. So how do you position yourself to get out alive, right?
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we have a combat story first, as we hear firsthand from Rob Peters, who spent almost 30 years in the Navy on submarines from the mid-1990s to just this year. Rob served on 5 different subs and commanded twice. In this episode, we cover some of the different types of subs, the training, the mission sets, to include Special Operations Force support and delivery, attack parameters, missile launches, and more. We found Rob thanks to a former guest and forever friend of the show, Todd Opalski, the Marine sniper and recon operator invited to Delta. He and Rob met in an unusual way, and Todd, a decorated combat leader himself at truly the highest level, suggested strongly that I interview Rob not just for some unique and humorous insights from a life underwater, but also for the leadership experiences and learnings Rob shared with Todd. To me, that is high praise coming from Opalski. With that, please enjoy this deep dive into the deep ocean of submarines with Rob Peters. Rob, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ryan. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So we got connected in a very unusual way. Many people who listen to this podcast know the name Todd Opalski, very decorated and accomplished Marine enlisted officer, sniper, force recon, and then invited over to Delta. He's done it all, and people loved hearing his story. So for people listening, Todd connected me with Rob. And Rob, I'd love to hear how you two met and what those conditions were.
Yeah, Ryan. So who would ever think that a crayon-eaten Marine would meet, a washed-up sailor in the middle of nowhere? So the scene was Olallie Lake, Oregon. I'm through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail northbound, and so is Todd. And I was already there. I stopped for resupply. I was going to camp there for the night, and I just happened to run into Todd. This guy's, in tank top, and I can see his tattoos. And oh, clearly he's a veteran. It's just, I think veterans, when they see other veterans, it's an instant, connection. It's like, oh, you got a different vibe from the people who normally hike the trail. And we got to talking and, hit it off pretty quickly. And then he said he's on his way. He just stopped in for supplies and he's going up the trail. I'm like, cool, hopefully run into you, and that was it. So the next morning, I usually get up at ODark 30 and I'm out of camp by 05 and I'm heading up and Todd just happened to be stopped somewhere a couple miles north of where I camped for the night. And then we started talking again. Next thing you know, we're hiking together. And for the next 600 miles, we hiked and finished the Pacific Crest Trail northbound together. So we spent, we joked about it. We called ourselves Team Blue Green. And, there's a picture of us at the Canadian border holding an American flag. It was great. That's and, Todd's a great American, fantastic career, just an all around great person. And, my career dwarfs his and what he's done for this country. But it's a pleasure to be mentioned it's an honor to be mentioned in the same name as him. We're in 2 completely different leagues.
He holds you in the same regard because that's what he was saying. He has never referred somebody to this show, and he's like, Ryan, you have to interview Rob. And so 600 miles, how many days is that?
Hiking number of days, probably 20 days.
Jeez.
We were averaging 25 to 30 miles a day. That was what we were doing at that point on the trail, and yeah, it's, for a guy who basically spent most of his time on submarines, hiking that many miles a day, takes a little work. You get used to it though.
Yeah. Was he just sprinting this whole time? I mean, I imagine he does this pretty fast. Yeah.
He's a pro. And I can keep up for the most part. There were some days he got ahead and, but at the end of the day, we know where we're going to rally. So, generally we had a rally point. We've just set up where we'd stop and, have water, have food and stuff like that. But generally, we would just leapfrog. And by the time you're there, you're over 2,000 miles hiked. So you become pretty much a professional walker. And, you get good at, walking with a ruck on your back.
I still remember him when I interviewed him. He said, he's like, I just loved Ranger School. Like, oh, you're just outside the whole time, rucking. It's great. And I was like, nobody says that. So
Yeah. It's
right.
it's funny because my wife and we've joked about it over the years. Like, hey, when you get out of the Navy, we ought to go on a cruise. I'm like, no, I'm not paying money to go to sea. I spent a chunk of my adult life getting paid to go to sea, and I'm like, I'm not ready for that.
Yeah.
So for someone who lived in outdoors doing their job and then wanting to do it afterwards, that's a different level.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. What was the inspiration for you to actually do that trail?
Yeah. I fell in love first with the Appalachian Trail back in 2008. In fact, I didn't even know it existed. And I was stationed in DC and took my family to Shenandoah National Park, and we discovered the Appalachian Trail. And it's like, wow, this thing goes from Georgia to Maine. I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. And I started hiking it because at the time I was like, I wasn't really happy that the Navy sent me to DC. I just kind of, you accept orders, roger that, and you go do it. But I made it a point, everywhere I've lived, I make it a point to, embrace the assignment, embrace the area that I live in. So what better way to see Virginia than hike it?
Yeah.
And, over a quarter of the trail, the Appalachian Trail's in Virginia. And so I started hiking it and I started enjoying it. And I backpacked and camped as a kid and as a young adult. So I enjoyed doing it. It was just rediscovering it. And, fast forward as I'm getting ready to leave the military, I'm at this point, I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail. I've hiked over 1,000 miles of it. I'm like, all right, I got to hike another trail. I had already set up my mind that I'm not going straight into the job market. I'm going to, I need to mentally reset for my career and figure out what my priorities in life are. So that was the impetus behind it, to answer your question. So what I ended up doing was, after I retired in March of this year, in the fall of 2023, I decided I'm going to through hike Pacific Crest Trail. And so I retired on the 1st of March this year. And 21 days later, I have a backpack on my back. I'm at the Mexican border. It's warm out. It's Campo, California. I'm walking north and I'm pinching myself going, what am I doing? It was surreal that first day. And then, 159 days later, I'm at the Canadian border.
Good on you. Did you find your meaning at the end of that trail?
Yeah, I think I did. One thing I did discover is the most important thing in my life is time. That's the thing I didn't realize. I think part of it was when I left the military, I didn't understand my priorities in life. And, to me, time was, I think you put in hierarchies, God, family, country, always, always, always. But in terms of just personal, while I'm here, my time's worth more than anything. So it's affected the way I view, my decisions from that point on. And I think living out of, basically everything I own in my life is worn on my back. And every day it was food, water, distance, shelter. When that becomes your priority every day, it just made me rethink my priorities in life. And time became the thing that was the most valuable.
Okay. So as I mentioned, as we were kicking off, you are our first submariner. Is that how I should say it?
Submariner. Although
Submariner.
I think some other people say submariners. I've been called worse names in my life. So,
okay. Got it. So
yeah.
we've got a lot of ground to cover, but I am interested, kind of growing up, what piqued your interest? Maybe in just in the Navy in general, or was it always subs from the start?
Oh gosh, it wasn't subs at the start. My dad was a World War II and Korea vet, and then after, he was a CB in World War II. So he dropped out of high school at the age of 17, enlisted in the Navy with his dad's permission. Went to boot camp, and his dad was in the Navy earlier before World War II, and said, "Hey, you should go on ships." And so he's like, oh, okay, you'll see action on ships. And so he did. Then he joined this organization called the Seabees. So the Navy just sent him to this thing called Seabees, and he found out they get dropped off and they get shot at while they're building airstrips in the Pacific. So that's what he ended up doing in World War II. And then after World War II, he went back to Illinois and finished up high school. And then he joined the Air Force. And then in the Air Force, he was a comms guy, enlisted comms guy. And he was in the Korean War, and then he retired in 1964. Growing up, I heard stories of the military and service, and it kind of ran in my family. So I always, from an early age, I always wanted to serve my country. I just had no idea, what vehicle or how that was going to go down. And also, I'm the first one in my family to make it past high school. So there was a big push from my mom and dad to say, hey, you ought to go to college. I was kind of on the fence. In high school, I was like, I want to join the Marine Corps. I had some friends who had enlisted in the Marine Corps. I'm like, yeah, that sounds like fun, carry on guns and go do cool shit and break stuff. And, as a 16, 17-year-old knucklehead, that's perfectly in my line of thinking. And, I got talked into going to college, giving a year a try. And so I did that. And I ended up going to college. I was interested in serving, so I checked out the ROTC program. I was encouraged to apply for a ROTC scholarship, and I earned one because of my grades. And so I decided to sign on the dotted line in 1991, and the rest is history. I think during, as in ROTC, you get these summer cruises where you get exposed to different occupations. And I did one of my cruises was on a submarine. And I was like, this is pretty interesting. And we ended up shooting 2 test missiles. It was wild. It was a pretty cool cruise. I'm like, these are my people. This is my tribe. They're competent. I can trust my life to them. They know what they're doing. They kind of have a twisted sense of humor. But they seem squared away as compared to other types of organizations I saw in the Navy. And so my senior year of college, I volunteered for the nuclear power program, which you have to go through an interview if you're an officer candidate, and you have to go back to Washington, D.C. to this Naval Reactors headquarters. And I got interviewed for the program, and for reasons to this day I still don't know, I got accepted. And so when I graduated college in 1994, I reported to nuclear power school in Orlando, Florida. And, and the only way, I didn't have an engineering background, so I had a math degree. And so I didn't know much about engineering or any of that. And I was told along the way the Navy will teach you. And they did. But, really my goal was to get on submarines. That was the coolest thing. The whole nuclear power thing, at least when I was 22 years old, this was just a means to an end. Mm-hmm. And that's how I ended up in the Navy and in the submarines. I had a great experience.
So the nuclear power track didn't guarantee you were going to go to subs.
Well, you can volunteer. So when you get accepted to the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program as an officer, you either volunteer for submarine duty or you choose to go to the carrier Navy. At the time, that was the choice. You either go to carriers or surface fleet, or you go to the Navy, to submarine Navy. I volunteered for submarine duty because I was like, this is cool. As long as you're physically qualified, the nuclear training is the same. So there's classroom training for 6 months, and then you go to a land-based, we call it prototype, or basically a reactor plant, and you have to qualify to operate on it before you're sent to your first ship, and that's for enlisted and officers. So the schooling is similar between enlisted and officer. There are some differences in the academics, but overall the scope of the training is about the same. The enlisted train to qualify on a specific watch on board the power plant, whereas the officers qualify to be they call it engineering officer of the watch. You're the officer in charge of the propulsion plant and the watch team. And so you're trained, more to a supervisory role. Yeah. So the training is about a year. And it was pretty tough training. I think my lack of time management skills and, just general immaturity made the experience rougher for me. I am by no means a stellar graduate of this program. I scrapped through it. Nothing to be proud of on that. It damn near wasted me. So, just despite my own faults, I made it through.
I'm curious, a couple things there. Number one, are there a bunch of people who volunteer to go subs? Are you having to compete for those slots? And what are you doing day to day in that training? Like, I'm sure it's just second nature to you, but for somebody on the outside, like if I say I went to flight school and I learned to fly, people can, but I can't wrap my hands around exactly what you're doing. So I'm curious about that as well.
Yeah, good question. So I don't know if I think it's competitive, but I also know there's challenges. It goes in cycles, right? Some years people we meet recruiting goals. It's not a program that people typically flock to. It's it's technically demanding. It's notoriously tough. And I would argue people who are graduates of the program and serve honorably and go on to, a wide range of occupations in leadership and society. We have people just go out and just do basic things all the way to being the president of the United States. Jimmy Carter was a nuclear trained operator. He was the first nuclear trained operator to be president of the United States. Mm-hmm. So, I look at it from a standpoint of, the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, graduates of it are capable of doing virtually anything. We can pick up concepts very quickly. We're agile. We can think through problems critically, quickly, efficiently. And, we attribute it to, Hyman Rickover and the standards he set for the program. The standards are unrelenting and they're not negotiable. And, and getting used to that mindset was tough. So to answer your question, so what was it like? Nuclear power school, think of doing like equivalent of 2 years of graduate school in 6 months in a myriad of engineering topics. So things I never dealt with in my life. The only two things I dealt with in my life prior to that were physics and math. And those are the minimum requirements, by the way, for officers to enter the program. You had have a year of calculus and a year of calculus-based physics. So check and check. I had that. But I had no idea about electrical circuits or material science or electrical engineering or mechanical engineering. I couldn't even barely spell engineering.
And there's probably guys in the class with like degrees in these, like electrical engineering, mechanical, I imagine. Yeah.
100%. In fact, most people who enter as officers have engineering degrees. So most people I, went to class with had mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, nuclear engineering.
Do they look down on you? They're like, "Oh, you got a physics degree, math."
No. I think no. I mean, we're all in it together.
Yeah.
I wasn't the most academically. We'll just say I was below average academically.
Okay.
In a sea of exceptional people.
Got it.
And the difference. I don't even think there's a difference. The grade point average is probably the difference. All of us worked hard. I can't speak for them. What kept me afloat in the whole thing was I just refused to quit. I refuse to, I think anything in life is worth it. You have to be willing to put in the work to do it. And I'll be damned if I, quit or failed. It just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So, whatever it took. And one of the things that's funny is you had to maintain a certain grade point average. So one of the things that they did to encourage academic performance was if you weren't meeting, in the eyes of the staff, certain academic performance based on your demonstrated potential, you were put on mandatory study hours. So you were in class from 8 in the morning to 1600 or 4 p.m. every day, Monday through Friday. But, the baseline number of mandatory hours on top of, the 40-hour week or whatever the math was there, you had to do 30 additional hours of study. So we called it Mando 30. And people who were directed to be on mandatory 30 were typically called Mando Commandos. And, I was so challenged academically, and I don't know if they took pity on me, but I was never forced into mandatory 30 hours. I would just put in 40 to 50 to 60 hours
on
additional a week on my own. Nobody had to tell me to do it. I just sucked so bad that, I just had to, because I think for me, it was a combination of bad time management and the method in which the subject was taught just was incompatible with the way I learned. I think I had succeeded in college. College was easy. High school was easy. It's because I was in an environment where I had more control of my time and the way the information was coming in. Yeah. So I could actually, I'm more of a visual learner. And, and this is back in 1994, we're basically stenographers in class. The instructor would be lecturing on a chalkboard and would be writing up stuff. We'd be scribbling notes and so to me, it was just so much information for me at the time to take in. It wasn't, the concepts weren't super hard. It was just a lot of information. And all our exams were not multiple choice. They're all essay questions and you had to answer them a certain way. So it almost became a point where, you either understood them so you can write down the answers and get it correct, or you had to memorize them. And I was so far behind, I ended up, spending a lot of my time just memorizing it, which, in hindsight isn't helpful. But if you beat in enough information over time, the concepts come in.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, Aura Frames, and we'll get right back to this combat story. Let's be honest, what most people really want for the holidays is to see their favorite people more often. That's why this year, the best gift you can give, besides plane tickets, is an Aura digital picture frame. Named the #1 digital photo frame by Wirecutter, Aura frames are incredibly smart and easy to use, allowing you to upload unlimited photos and videos directly from your phone to the frame. Plus, you can order the frame online, preload it with photos and videos using the Aura app, so it's ready to go right out of the box. We have our Aura frame sitting in our kitchen and gave our sons access, so they upload some of the funniest pictures of each other, like one of them right after receiving an atomic wedgie. That just makes me smile pretty much every time I'm making dinner, getting a drink, and just going in and out of the kitchen. It's a nice surprise. I've even uploaded some photos of my folks who don't live nearby so we can get a glimpse of them more often, even if not in person. Save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver mat frames by using promo code COMBAT at checkout. That's auraframes.com, promo code COMBAT. This deal is exclusive to listeners, so get yours now in time for the holidays. Terms and conditions apply. And now, back to this combat story.
And then, so that was the first school. The second school, you had to qualify on a plant. So you had to get checkouts, so you're given we call it a call standard, but basically a booklet of basically knowledge and practical factors you had to get certified on. And you had to complete this entire book, which you had written exams, you had oral exams, and then at the end, you had a final board. You had to demonstrate on watch on an actual plant, normal and casualty operations, and pass the board. And then you had to pass this final board. So that, and that was challenging too, because, taking all this knowledge you learned in the school and then now applying it to an actual power plant, which was different from the one you're taught in school. And, so I went through that. And I think, what made that more challenging was halfway through, my dad passed away. And so I had to interrupt school for a week, and I still stayed within my class. They never rolled me back. And that weighed on me a little bit. And, in getting through that, I attribute that to my classmates. My classmates were super supportive.
That's awesome.
I wouldn't say at the time the staff was supportive. That was one of the reasons, I thought long, and that was one of the first leadership lessons in the Navy. The people at the staff were good people. They're hardworking people, but I think they pumped through so many students that, they didn't really view students as human beings per se. And again, this is the mid-90s. Things were a little bit different. Just because the times are different doesn't make it, right or wrong. But it did plant a seed in my head that, if put in a position of responsibility, people do matter. And that was the first seed as a young butter bar, ensign that was planted in my head about, if I ever have people under my charge that are having problems, I'm going to do my best to try to treat them as human beings, because I like to be treated the way, it's the golden rule. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first data point in my head. And that training was tough. I didn't learn the lessons completely. As fast forward, I go to my first submarine. The lessons that I should have learned in that school pay off always when I get to my first submarine. At the time, I was wondering why they trained us the way they did. And it made a whole lot of sense once I actually got to a submarine in a real ocean doing real things.
So they don't do any training on the sub in that year pipeline, it sounds like. So you complete that, and then you go to the sub.
You go to for submarine officers at the time, and now it's different. It's varied over the years, but the general sequence was, think of it, I'll use an aviation analogy. You go to a ground school first. Yeah. So the first 6 months is like ground school. And then you actually go to like what you would consider primary training. And so basically you're at a land-based, reactor plant. So basically I was at a campus, I'll use the civilian term, a campus in upstate New York, where there were a couple reactor plants there that the DOE and the Navy managed. And basically students, the prototype served two purposes. It's to test existing reactor technology. So we actually operate power plants and test them and do evaluations on them and test out procedures, et cetera. And at the same time, we also have a mission to train students. We have a requirement in place that before you go to your first actual nuclear powered ship, you have completed this training program. So think of it as, on the outside in commercial nuclear power, you have to get a national level certification. So a reactor operator's license. Like in the military, you were licensed to fly. Yeah. I don't know if you necessarily had an FAA pilot's license, but
you could get one with
the military had a certain, you had something along with it. So the Navy has its own regulatory, mechanism in lieu of, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So that's in essence what you're doing. You're getting qualified. And then during your first tour, so after your year of school, then I went to this 2 to 3 month school in Connecticut, where I learned, hey, you're going to a submarine. Here's some basics. Here's some things you're going to need to know before you're a division officer on a submarine.
What do they have to do, if anything, to get you prepared for, I guess, from the outside, the claustrophobia, the idea of being in the ocean the way you guys are away? Like, is there any acclimation that they give to get you ready?
Well, I think the nuclear program, does a good job of preparing you for that, because you're already, what I didn't realize was that culture was slowly being put into you during the nuclear training. And then when you get to submarine school, you go through trainers, and now you're interacting with people who are not nuclear trained. Some are nuclear trained, but now you start dealing with more. You're now as an officer, you also have enlisted instructors. You have to go to a damage control wet trainer, for example. So they put you in the same trainer that they put the enlisted sailors in, basically simulating an engine room that's flooding. You got to go in and work as a team to repair flooding. And as the water level from the river is going up and it's cold, and it's fun. Yeah. You learn submarine escape. You'll learn, basic, at the time, you learn basic watch standing. Like, what are some of the first watches you're going to stand as an officer on board the submarine? And so you get introduced to simulators, trainers. There's academic topics. It's pretty easy compared to the nuclear training. And I think for the nuclear trained officers, it was a welcome break. After a year of having a lot of information, shoved at you at alarming speed. And I use the term alarming for me, not for the people who got 4.0s and were super smart nuclear people. I had to learn by osmosis. I was strapping books to my head, and hoping that it would permeate into my skull. But yeah, so the submarine school was great. I actually really enjoyed the submarine school and took great interest in it, because that's the stuff I signed up to do. And I realized, I'm like, this is what I want to go do. I want to go drive the submarine. This is, then you go to your first submarine. So I reported my first submarine in right after the new year in 1996. And until the middle of 1999, I was on the same submarine. And that was an eye opener. And that was a pretty interesting time. Good time to grow up.
So there are like a few things here. So help me with the sequencing. Yeah. I want people to understand the basics of submarines, but also I don't want to lose this thread. Maybe just how is a new officer brought into a sub? Like, you're brand new. It's always different in different military units. I'm curious in that community, what they do. Yeah.
So, when I go to answer that question, so it's multi-part, I'm going to answer it in order. When I get to that part, I'm going to preface it with, this was the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s. Okay. So the way I'm telling the story is through the lens of the mid 90s, all male submarine force, and the things we did then, we don't necessarily do now. Okay. I'll just caveat it with that. All right. Anyways, so a submarine basically is a ship that deliberately sinks and can also come back up. The number one rule of submarine, keep the ratio of surface to dives 1-to-1. Probably similar to aircraft, landings to takeoffs 1-to-1, right? And so basically a submarine is designed to be on the surface normally. And so it's positively buoyant. And to submerge it, you need to become negatively buoyant, where the buoyant force is basically less than the force of gravity. So then you sink. It's just like, imagine being a swimming pool. You have your lungs full of air and you can probably float on surface of the water. As soon as you exhale, you probably start sinking. Well, it's because you're losing your reserve buoyancy and you're actually becoming negatively buoyant. So the principle's similar. And on submarines, what we have is we have two sets of ballast. We have variable ballast and we have fixed ballast. And so when the submarine's on the surface, we engineer the submarine and load it in such a way that it stays safe and on the surface, so positively buoyant. And so we have ballast tanks in the forward and aft parts of the submarine, which keep air in them. So we have vents at the top that are shut, and then we have grates at the bottom. So just imagine putting a cup upside down the water. There's always a pocket of air. If you punched a hole in the top of the cup, the water would fill up because the air is being displaced out, right? Yeah. So that's basically how a submarine submerges. We just open the vents on the main ballast tanks, bringing in all this water, and the submarine just becomes overall negatively buoyant in theory and should sink and go down and get underwater. Now, what makes it interesting, of course, is a submarine, basically, think of it like an aircraft, except it flies through the water. So it's a watercraft. And so all the forces that are present in aircraft flying through the air are flying, it's similar to a submarine flying through the water. So you have X, Y, and Z. You have yaw, you have pitch, you also have roll, but you also have attitude, and you also have speed. So and unlike an aircraft, you can just sink static, right? Well, that doesn't really give you a degree of control and rate. So you want to be going through the water because the hull itself of the submarine, depending on its attitude, has a certain lift or non-lift force. And then you also have control surfaces. So you have control surfaces like rudders, which control yaw, basically X direction, left and right. Then you have we call stern planes in the back, which typically control the pitch or the attitude of the submarine. And then we have normally control surfaces up front, either on the bow called bow planes or fairwater planes, which are located up in the sail. So the bumpy part of the submarine, you look on the surface, has this little notch at the top where people are up there when they're on the surface. That's called the sail. And sometimes older submarine designs, some submarine designs have control surfaces on the sail, and then some have it below the waterline, and they're called bow planes. Anyways, that controls depth normally. Anyways, that's basic submarine construction. And basically you use, once you're submerged, you're flying through the water, you use a combination of planes, angle of the submarine, and the speed of the submarine to control your trim condition. So in general, that's how you keep a submarine neutrally buoyant. Whereas in a fixed wing aircraft, you have those factors also. You have your attitude, you have your control surfaces, and then you have trim for aileron, elevator, rudder. Some submarines have trim for it, but the submarines I served on didn't typically have trim specifically for the surfaces. So the old-fashioned way of maintaining a submarine neutrally buoyant in the water was a combination of planes, angle, and speed, and your ballast loading. So your ballast tanks are full of water when you're submerged, and then you move variable ballast. You have tanks inside the submarine to change the moments to trim up your submarine. So if you're hands off, you should maintain a certain, we call a neutral angle, just going through the water. And that's if you're perfectly trimmed. I'll just use that as plain terminology. So that's how a submarine goes through the water. And if you want to go deeper, you just adjust your control surfaces to go down, just like flying aircraft, right? I've been told flying aircraft is pretty simple. You push forward, the trees get bigger. You pull back, the trees get smaller. And then we go faster and slower. Right? That's what I've been told.
That's right. I mean, that's what I like to say to fixed wing guys. The rotary wing is even harder. That's what I like to mess with them a little bit.
Okay, so this is submarine. The front end's called the bow. The stern is the end is called the stern. So these are the control surfaces, right? So you have the rudder, which is up and down. That controls yaw. You have the stern planes, which go up and down. Think of them like elevators, except they control attitude. And then you have the fairwater planes. Some ships have bow planes up here. That controls depth typically because you can see they're smaller than the stern planes. Yeah. So they have less, so these have way less of a moment. In the center, the pivot point's right here. The center of gravity is right here. So that moment is way smaller than that moment, right? Yep. And when you surface, you come back up using speed typically. There's exceptions sometimes, but typically you use speed to come up, keep yourself up near the surface, and then you force yourself up and slowly blow out all the water out of your ballast tank. So your vents are shut and you just force air into the ballast tanks, which expels the water underneath the grates out. And then your ballast tanks slowly start filling up with air and you just become overly positively buoyant. And then you're on the surface. And then you to prevent inadvertent submerging, then you lock certain things and prevent certain things from being operated. And in essence, that is a submarine 101. Yeah. So it's a ship that deliberately sinks and deliberately comes back up.
We used to say, or my dad flew Hueys in Vietnam. So he would tell me this saying, I think it was takeoffs are optional, landings are mandatory. Just this idea that you're coming down one way or another. So the 1-to-1 ratio, I really like that.
It's important to get to the surface.
How deep, I guess the unclassed version, how deep would you go and how fast are you moving through the water?
Yeah. So we can go deeper than, 400 feet and we can go faster than 20 knots or 20 nautical miles an hour. We can go faster than that. And that's about it. That's as much as I'll say. But basically imagine, so our largest submarines, an Ohio class submarine, it typically is anywhere from 16,000 to 18,000 tons. And so imagine something of an object that size, and you can see, you can Google pictures of an Ohio class submarine in dry dock, from the bottom of the submarine, we call it the keel of the ship, to the tallest antenna is almost 100 feet, just to give you perspective. From the keel to the highest antenna when raised on this class of submarines, 100 feet. And that's a pretty big submarine. So this is, an Ohio class submarine. This displaces, 18,000 tons with missiles on board. And, it's as big as a Space Needle. So if you took the Seattle Space Needle and laid it, from bow to stern. That's how tall it is, just to give you an idea how big this thing is. And it's, 42 feet wide. So it's a large draft vessel, and that's not an attack submarine. This is our largest submarine.
Yeah.
Attack submarine's about from here to here. It's about 360 feet long and displays at only like 6,000 to 7,000 tons. So, and they carry a smaller cargo. But other things. The last submarine I commanded was not nuclear weapons. It carried a dry dock shelter for special operating forces. The cargo that the Ohio class submarine holds, a Trident D5 missile, is like a 4-story missile. It's a 3-stage solid propellant missile. Oh yeah. And so it was the Navy designed the submarine back in the 1970s to carry 24 of these things. And so imagine 24, 4-story missiles. Now, originally, the original Ohios carried a smaller missile called the C4, which is smaller than that. So it's about three stories and change. But the submarine was designed to accommodate a larger missile that came into play in the late 80s called the D5. And that's the missile that's carried on board nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines today, is the Trident II D5 missile. So that's the big missile. And then the smaller one was what I started with. The first submarine I was on, we carried C4 missiles. Okay. And but regardless, they're all solid fuel, 3-stage missiles basically that carried a payload at the top.
Okay.
And basically we carried them around. So you need a submarine big enough to house them.
Yeah, amazing.
And run around the ocean. So it's pretty crazy.
So with the caveat that this is the mid 90s and things have probably changed a little bit. Yeah. What's it like being a new officer getting to, do you call it a ship or a sub when you're talking?
Submarine, first ship, first submarine.
Okay.
I think part of it, and one of the things I like about submarine culture, is that if you're not qualified, so every person that shows up to a submarine for the first time is not qualified in submarine. And so officers and enlisted have to earn, we call their dolphins, your warfare insignia, kind of like, people who earn their ranger tabs or jump wings or whatever certification you have, or your wings. And so there's a process in which officers and enlisted have to earn their qualifications. And if you're not qualified on a submarine back then, you're typically, it's rank independent. That was one of the things I loved about submarine culture, was nobody gave two shits about your rank. It really came down to your level of knowledge, your skill, your integrity, and those things mattered more to crew members, because it's a small crew. We have a crew anywhere from 120 to 160 people. Everybody, and everybody has multiple jobs on board. And the two worst enemies on a submarine at any time are fire and flooding. And all crew members, from the captain to the lowest sailor, have to be able to be a part of the effort to save the ship. So the culture on board a submarine is tighter, and every person counts. And so when you show up to a submarine, you're a new guy. You're back then we call them nubs, non-useful bodies. And so every one of us that showed up that weren't qualified, you have to go through all your qualifications. For officers, it's typically about a year and a half to qualify to earn your dolphins. And then for enlisted, it's up to about a year. And the qualifications are different. For the officers, we have to qualify all our watches first before we're considered for our dolphins. Whereas if you're enlisted, you have to qualify one in port and one at sea watch before, and then complete your qualification before you go for a board and qualify. So the qualifications are different, but you're still not qualified. If you're not qualified, you're not qualified. Yeah. And, one of the most useless things in the world is not to be qualified anything on board. So you can't do it. You're not qualified to operate anything. So that's like the worst level of citizenship on board a submarine. So, regardless if you're an O1, I start off as an O1 butter bar. So I'm the useless of the useless, at the beginning. And, in addition, you're trying to do your qualifications and start earning your keep on board, so you have to work on your qualifications, get qualified watch stations, stand watch under instruction. So you're doing, watches under instruction on a rotating basis while you're qualifying, going to training and doing all this other stuff. And you're also, I was a division officer for a group of, my first division was electricians. And shout out to Scott Brady, my first chief. That man made more of an impact in my career than almost anybody in my 30-year career. And I was proud to be at his retirement, and he showed up to mine. And that guy's an amazing human being. And, it's kind of like your senior NCO equivalent. He's the guy that taught me how to lead. He provided the first example, and it was a good example. He was fair. He was hard on himself, but he was hard on his people, but he was consistent. And, he treated people with dignity and respect, and he held up high personal standard. And that was a good thing for a 23-year-old person like me to emulate. So he was kind of my first imprinting, in the Navy of who a leader is. And, I owe the world to that man. And, and those lessons as you grow older, they come back and you're like, oh, that's what he meant. Because you don't always learn. It's like, being a parent, you discover, flashes of your own parents when you're a parent. It's, I learned those things as I progressed through the Navy and grew older.
Let me ask you real quick, Rob, before, so when you're standing watch, that is effectively something's happening in a particular part of the sub, and how do you respond and dictate what happens next and resolve it?
Yeah. So on the submarine, the entire vessel, it's man vehicle. My first submarine had 160 people on it, and there are watchstanders throughout the ship performing different functions. So mainly there's enlisted watchstanders in key spaces, doing key things, operating key pieces of equipment. And then you have two officers typically on watch. Officer of deck is the captain's direct representative. He or she is responsible for basically executing the plan of the day, executing the ship's operations, and getting the ship from point A to point B and driving the ship around. He or she's on watch to allow the captain to sleep.
Okay.
And so basically they're on watch. And then, at the time I joined the Navy, we were on 6 on, and basically, we're in what we call 3-section watch rotation, or sometimes 4. So 24-hour day, you're on 6-hour watches. So basically, the ship's routine was broken up, battle rhythm was broken up into 4 blocks per day. 0600 to noon to 1800, 18 to 24, and then, midnight to 6.
Okay.
So you can imagine how the day goes through that way. And you stand a 6-hour watch. So for officers, underway, I'm not talking in port. When you're at sea, officers manned basically one of 2 watches, typically. And this was in the mid-90s. So, when you're starting off as a young officer, you have to qualify back in the engine room. So I had to qualify engineering officer of the watch first, which is what I qualified at that prototype school I talked about. Except now it's on a ship. It goes through the water. It's a completely different reactor plant than the one I studied. Completely different. And I'm already academically handicapped, so I got that awesome thing working for me. So so I nugged through my quals and I start standing watch. And so basically you're on a watch rotation. And then as you're qualified that watch, you're also taking on your time off, you're going up to start qualifying other watches. I had to qualify diving officer of the watch, and then I had to qualify officer of the deck. And then officer deck is there's 2 qualifications. You're either surfaced or submerged. They're different watch stations, because driving a ship underwater is different from driving a ship on the surface.
Okay.
On the surface, you have to follow certain rules, the same rules that other ships have to follow around the world. So there's an international standard in avoiding collision, for example, that you have to be familiar with. But when you're underwater, those rules don't apply. So it's a different set of rules. And so there's a whole process in which you got to learn. And in submarine qualification, it's not only just standing watch and, driving the ship. In the submarine force, unlike other communities, you also have to have working knowledge of all the systems on board the submarine. So just as simple as, how do we make water? Well, you got to be able to discuss how we make potable drinking water. How do we generate electricity? How do we, how are things constructed? What's the reason why we chose certain materials for their construction? How do you have to know normal operating procedures, normal casualty procedures, your immediate action? So think of similar to your occupation. You had to learn emergency procedures for your, and then you get evaluated similar to a check ride at the end. Then you have an oral board.
Yeah.
And so the qualification process is very similar. And that process took me about, a little over a year, between a year and a half, something like that, just the way our operational schedule was. But yeah, so I got qualified and, standing watch around the ship. But yeah, that's basically the process. And then enlisted are similar. They qualify a watch station, import at sea. They have to also understand ship systems. So regardless of what your job is, so in the Army, I think it's called MOS, Air Force AFSC. And then in the Navy, it's called NEC, and Navy Enlisted Classification. So whatever your MOS is, I'll just use that terminology. Doesn't matter if you're a cook, you turn wrenches, or you fix nuclear things. It doesn't matter. Every crew member has to have baseline knowledge of how the ship operates, how it's constructed, how it's designed, and also be able to fight fires, control, know where all the flood control levers are, know where all the emergency things are, the basic, general things. If you're in any compartment at any given time, you're able to respond and be useful. So that's, and then for officers, it's similar, and to be in charge, take charge and be able to give directions. And then the officers get the additional bit of, understanding, how to drive the submarine to position for shooting a weapon and engaging a target, and also evading and surviving. So that's a completely separate art. So everything I've talked to up to this point is just learning how to operate it in normal emergency conditions. And I think as an officer's career progresses, you get much more education in using the warship as a weapon system to track down, engage targets, and also evade. And that's a completely different art form. But the building blocks for that start in the training. So you got to first learn how to avoid collision. You got to first, with only hearing things in the water, be able to manage contacts just from noise coming from different directions, and how to develop a tactical picture in your head. And there's an art, there's a science and art to doing that. And it's not something that, you learn overnight. I happen to be better at it than operating a nuclear power plant. And that's where I found my joy in the job was the people, and also being able to drive the ship.
So what, when you get there, do they mess with you somehow?
Oh yeah.
Like what, is there something that they do to newbies coming into the nubs?
Yeah. One fun one was, stapling we wear coveralls underway, and they kind of look like prison mechanic suits, or, prison suits. And, one fun trick that I've had done to me was somebody stapled my pant legs. So when I get out of my rack and go put it on, I can't put my legs through,
Yep.
Oh gosh, they'll freeze your pillow. I've also heard people getting, you adjust the temperature in the ventilation zone where you're sleeping, so it's really hot. You can tweak the temperature and mess with people. Yeah. Oh, there's tons of things you can do to people. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Basically, it would be classified as hazing today.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering when you said caveating that it was the 90s. I assumed there was something there.
Yeah, and 80s and before, people did stuff that was in today's world would be just alarm bells going off. But yeah. And there was just a way of handling things back then that was a little more personal than it is today.
Got it.
We'll just say that.
We'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And I mean, think back to your own childhood. How was accountability meted out in your childhood versus now as a parent, right? And so, I think it's good for young men to grow up. It's just because we did it then doesn't make it right. I'm not here to condone it. It's just the system we were in. But we played jokes on each other, and even today we still play jokes on each other. I have stories of
when appropriate, please throw them out. So let's just say, so you're at your first ship. You're going through your progressions. Yeah. You mentioned before, you kind of alluded to, or not alluded to, you mentioned I
just did a summer cruise.
A cruise, yeah. So when you're doing the cruise, that they fired missiles. Right. So
we shot test missiles.
Can you just what is that like on a ship? I know exactly how it feels to pull a trigger on an Apache and see something leave the rail. Yeah. Like, obviously you mentioned the tactical picture. Just walk us through what that is like.
Yeah. So basically, imagine the engineering challenge, right? You got a 4-story solid rocket motor missile. And in order for it to light, you don't want it to be, saturated with seawater. So how do you get a submarine that's underwater to shoot a missile out of the water, and then once it's dry, to ignite and take off and go towards its target, right? So that in itself is pretty cool. Basically, you basically launch the missile out of the water in an air bubble. So how do you do that? Well, basically, you have a tank of water which has a rocket motor strapped to it. You ignite the rocket motor, it flashes the water to steam, and then the hatches open, and you have this, plastic or this basic something that's keeping the missile from flooding out. It breaks at the same time that the water ignites the steam, and basically the missile's just ejected out of the tube. And then it gets out, it rides basically in a blanket of bubbles until it reaches the surface. It broaches the water, and then once you meet certain parameters, the rocket motor starts, and then it takes off and goes. So that's a lot of weight leaving a ship that's underwater. So if you remember, if you've ever been underwater, or have you ever done any scuba diving?
Yeah.
So if you imagine if you're underwater scuba diving and you're in a wetsuit, which is positively buoyant normally, and let's say you just jettison your lead belt, you just let go of it, you're going to start coming up. And imagine letting go of a lot of weight and the ejection force of a big 4-story object leaving the submarine coming out. It's really loud, by the way. It's just freaking amazing. So it's this really loud noise. The entire ship goes down in the water and comes back up, and it levels, because we also have a compensation system. So the missile itself is a certain weight or a certain mass. When it leaves, you have to make up for it if you want to stay neutral at the end. So you have this down up transient, right? If you want to keep it level at the end, you need to compensate for it, because it turns out the missile that we launched weighs more than if you just filled the tube entirely with water. So you're going to have to bring water in to keep neutrally buoyant, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so it's just this really loud noise. I mean, and the whole ship just goes down, up, and it kind of stables out. And then the hatch comes shut, the next hatch comes open. We launch the second missile, and these are test missiles. And it was amazing, and these missiles can go, a couple thousand miles with no GPS. They can hit targets thousands of miles away, very, very accurately. And it turns out at the time, in 1993, I had no appreciation in how much those missiles constitute our strategic deterrent. There are a national insurance policy. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why the Russians, the Chinese, and other adversaries don't mess with us, is because 24/7, there's these submarines running around the ocean, ready to go, waiting for a presidential order. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate that. But we also test these missiles to make sure they still work. And, years later, I was part of a program that was the group that helped train and certify the weapon system, and also did operational evaluation, test and evaluation of those missiles in a different job later in my career. But yeah,
that's cool.
That was pretty cool. And so as a young, 21-year-old kid, I'm just like, this is freaking cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's like, I'm on a ship that just shoots giant missiles. I'm like, this is, and, so I was all in at that point. I was like, okay, my tribe, these people know what they're doing. I can trust my life to them, and they do cool shit. So put that all together. It's like, I'm sold. Yeah.
How about torpedoes? Same feel or?
No, torpedoes are way smaller. They're 21 inches diameter. And when they shoot out, you don't even feel it leave the ship, because, you're talking like an 18,000 ton vessel, and torpedoes maybe a ton and change, it's such a small object. And what you hear is the impulse leaving the ship. So we use air in some classes of ships to basically turn a turbine to force water. So we use water. We jet out the torpedoes with water, but we use air to initiate the process. And really what you hear in the ship is, like the submarines I served on were pretty loud. The launch transient, you would hear air, or there was a ram. In another class of submarine, we used a ram that basically actuated, and it just forced, both of them used water to force the torpedoes out. So all you hear is the sound of that ejection system. And then if it used air, you'd feel the air change, the pressure change in the submarine. You get to the point now where modern submarines, they're a lot quieter. And our newest submarines, if you launch a torpedo, if you're in the right place in the ship, you can hear it launch. But other parts of the ship, you just feel a pressure transient. Like, did we just launch a torpedo? Yeah. Torpedo is way smaller than the missiles that we launch, and yeah.
How long are you out at sea for? Again, if this is an unclassed topic, obviously.
Yeah, we typically go out to sea. The limitation's food. Really, it comes down to food. The longest I've been out to sea without coming back to port's 100 days straight. That was the longest I've been. And that was when I was in command of my first submarine. We spent 100 days at sea. But, I've had it short as just a couple nights. Really, it comes down to food. We make our own oxygen. We make our own water, and we load up supplies. And really, the limit, since it's a manned vehicle, is the food. The most food I've ever put on board a ship was my last deployment when I was in command of another ship. We put about 140 to 150 days of food on board.
Wow.
Yeah. And you had to pack it in, freezers and refrigerator. Actually, we didn't use it. We converted one of our refrigerators into a freezer. So we had 2 big freezers, and then we had a bunch of dry stores, and you just find places to put stuff in. Okay.
So I'm going to ask a couple other questions, but I would ask you to steer me to these 5 different ships and your experiences on these different cruises. I think there's something, maybe the intel side of me, less the aviation side, although there's similarities, but the intel side, I do wonder, it feels similar in that, like, we might not have been in a war zone when we were always deployed or, operating, but it was always a real world mission. I feel like you guys are always on a real world mission. Whereas like maybe some, in the military, if we were in garrison, that was training. But the agency, every time we're out, that is real world and you have to operate like that. So I would imagine you guys are always out there and it's always hunter versus hunted at any time.
That's one of the things I mentioned to you, before this was, you're not going to get any glamorous stories of kicking down doors or doing anything like that. The submarine, every time it leaves the pier, we're in the environment. We may be training, but you can still hit things. You can run aground. You can have a fire. You can have flooding. So the enemy is, mainly it's the ocean. The submarine pressure hull is subjected to sea pressure all the time. And so we rely on, quality maintenance practices, unnegotiable standards on that, proper operating procedures, alert crew members who question their indications, and training. And then, fires. Fires are very bad, especially in a very close space. So you got to put them out very quickly. And flooding is bad too, because, you can die pretty quickly. So, the hazard is always there. With the submarine, like all ships, the entire unit goes with the ship. So we're all out there in the environment, 24/7 underwater. And so, that adds an element to it. I think, to the uninitiated, or if you've never been, you've had troubles before, you don't realize it until, when I was young, I didn't realize my own mortality or the chances of it until I was on my first submarine.
How so?
Oh gosh, it was near the end of my tour. So we're on the surface and we brought an inspection team on board, and the inspection team wanted us to run our diesel generator. So on the submarine, we have a diesel generator. It's a backup power source. So if for whatever reason we have to shut down the reactor at sea, we need to maintain electrical power. We have a battery on board. We also have a diesel generator. So diesel generator has a bunch of fuel, and we can still keep the lights on and keep the battery charged up. So it's an emergency battery source. But the inspection team wanted us to run the diesel and do certain things with it to evaluate the operator's ability to operate the diesel proficiently at sea. So in order to do it in the situation we were forced to be on the surface. So on submarines, we just don't dive the ship. We have to be given permission to operate submerged in that area. So think of it like transition to Class C airspace, for example, or permission to take off. Yeah. Right. So you're given permission to do that. It's comparable but different. Anyways, we didn't own the water, so we had to be on the surface. And we're heading out, and this is in the Pacific Northwest in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So this is if you look at the map of Washington and Canada, Vancouver Island's to the north, Washington State's to the south. There's a strait that separates Puget Sound from the Pacific Ocean. So we're heading out there. We're heading west, and it's like in April or May. It's in the late 90s. And I remember it was getting stormier and stormier. I'm officer deck. I'm up on the bridge with a lookout. So I got this kid up there with me, and we're both kids. But I'm the officer. I'm on watch. I'm the guy driving the ship around, giving commands and navigating the ship. And as we're getting out, the seas are getting rougher and rougher. So the period of the waves from wave top to wave top are changing, and the amplitude's getting bigger and bigger in such a way that, as the submarine's riding on the surface, and the waves come, we're starting to drop into troughs, and the ship is starting to partially submerge. So the bow, when you see videos of ships in rough seas, they hit and a bunch of water comes over. We're starting to experience that.
Are you sticking out of the top here, or are you looking outside?
I'm in that tower. I'm in the tower, and and so me and this guy, the lookout, we're in harnesses. So we're in body harnesses, and we're clipped into the submarine. And so that's first fact. So we're clipped in the submarine. We're on watch. We're actually up there doing stuff. So he's maintaining a proper lookout, looking for other ships. We don't want to hit ships. And I'm also looking around, don't hit other ships. We have a radar, and we got some other things up there so I can write with and stuff like that. And we also have these radar reflectors, these little, at the time, we had these aluminum things that help. So when other ships have their radars on, a submarine's really hard to spot because we have a low radar cross section because we're just low to the water. Yeah. And we're kind of hard to spot. So to make ourselves more visible at the time, the thought process was, let's hang more shit off the submarine metal to get a better radar return. That was the theory back then. And so these radar reflectors made of aluminum, and they're tethered to the ship. They're clipped on. And we have a bunch of stuff up in the bridge that we have to pack up and bring down below. And there's a long tube called the bridge access hatch. It's got two hatches. It's got an upper hatch and a lower hatch. and that connects down. The lower hatch connects down to the pressure hull, the people tank where the people are in. And so basically when you're on the surface, they're both open. So a person can go from the sail all the way down into the pressure hull of the submarine. It's about 25 feet, 25 feet. Anyways, waves are coming over the submarine now. And the seas are getting rough. And I'm like, okay, this sucks. It's cold. The Pacific Ocean's not a warm ocean in that part. And, we're still running, we're going to do this test. And I start calling down below. I'm talking to the navigator. I'm like, hey, man, I think it's starting to get rough. We may want to consider turning around if we want to keep doing this test, because I don't know how long I can safely maintain a watch up here. At the time, it was still manageable. There's some waves going over. It's all good. But it was definitely getting worse. And we were starting to parse the wave, the way the wave, period was, and the amplitude was getting worse and worse. And we were starting to pound, every couple minutes, the bow would go into the waves more, and we would start getting more seawater. The other interesting thing is on the submarine that I was on, the sail is in a free flood area. So you have the pressure hull, but then you have a superstructure built over it. And the reason that superstructure exists is so when the missile tubes come open, it's a hydrodynamic fairing, if that makes sense. If you didn't have that superstructure, it was just the pressure hull, the hatch would just come open, just be a curved hull, and it wouldn't be hydrodynamic going through the water.
Okay.
So you basically, think of a fairing like on your sports car, except you just wrap the fairing around the top of the submarine.
Yes.
Well, that fairing is a free flood area. So you have the pressure hull here and the fairing, and water can come in. So as the waves come in, the ship submerges, water comes in that free flood area. Well, the sail is connected to the fairing, and that's a free flood area too, up to that second hatch. I was telling you about the two hatches. They're both open. Well, that tube is waterproof when it's all shut, but right now they're both open. So water could come in from the ocean, if the waves are high enough, into the pressure hull and flood inside the submarine. We've actually had that happen before in the submarine force. Well, anyways, that was a risk as we started partially submerging. Well, what happens to all the air in the superstructure when the waves come in? Well, all that air has to go out somewhere. Well, it goes out the sail, and we call that phenomena sail breathing. And so what was happening was every time the ship partially submerged, like a massive gust of wind would come, and objects would just get jettisoned out of the cockpit because the forces, like gale force winds, and I'm literally holding on some of these waves as we're partially submerged. I'm literally holding on from being ejected. It was getting that bad. And so I'm like, holy crap, this is pretty legit. I'm holding on and I'm starting to realize if we keep going out, this is not going to be favorable. At some point my mind starts realizing this is probably a bad idea. I probably should get down below with my lookout, get him below, get me below. Let's shift the watch down below and start driving the ship from where it's safer. So I start having that dialogue with the people below, especially with the ship's navigator. I'm like, hey, man, I may need you to relieve me. It's starting to get really unsafe up here. And I'll never forget, like one of the waves, the first was one of those radar reflectors I was talking about, went flying and it hit my lookout in the face. And he got this gash and he was bleeding. And so I ended up giving him a relief. I got him down. He got treated. He just got a cut on his head, just bleed, from cutting your head. And another kid came up to be the lookout. And I remember, at some point we had hit so far down into the wave, I looked over the side and I couldn't see below me. Like there was a lot of water pretty close up to where I was for one wave, I remember. And I'm like, okay, this is it. This is freaking nuts. And I don't want to risk flooding the ship with me and the lookout trapped up here while they're taking water below. And they may be flooding and I don't even know. So, I check communications with below. Hey, you guys okay? Yeah, there's nothing down here. I'm like, cool. Hey, it's getting rough here. I'm ready to be relieved. So we do this process called rig for dive. Basically, you have to put the ship systems in a condition to support submerged operations. So there's certain things that me and this enlisted lookout have to do. He'll do the initial positioning and I'll do the verification. So it's a 2-man check. And we need to start that procedure. So I first need to get relieved. So someone below is responsible for driving the safe navigation of the ship. So once I turn that over, then I can do this thing with this crew member called rig for dive. Anyway, so I finally tell the navigators, like, you're relieving me. This is ridiculous. I can't safely maintain a watch up here because I'm too worried about not getting, knocked over by waves, ejected, whatever. And that was the first time in my life where I think I realized I'm probably immortal. And that, I'm an insignificant, thing in this drop of the ocean. And I probably should start guarding my safety a little bit more. And I'll never forget looking at the lookout. This kid's about the same age as me. and we're looking at each other, and no words were spoken, but it was very clear the time is now to start taking action. No words were spoken, and I turned over the watch, and we just started reading things, and and then I could feel the ship turning around. And we turn around, submarines are round hull. So when you're in waves and you're perpendicular, the submarine can take lots of rolls. And apparently, while we were up there, the ship took a pretty big roll, and a bunch of things went flying around the place because it was setting up for dinner and all this stuff, and just shit went flying everywhere, apparently down below. And I found that out once I got down. But as the ship was turning around, we hit perpendicular and we took a big roll. But when you're up on top, you don't really notice it because you're just up there. It's kind of like, you ever flown in an airplane where you don't have any windows, like a transport. If you're, in-flight refueling and you kind of have this little oscillation, and or if you're bumpy on a ride and you have no frame of reference, you can get sick, where you don't realize where you're at. It's just a very similar sensation. But yeah, that was the first time I realized, like, okay, this is for real.
I believe it. Yeah. God, especially out in the ocean.
This is a 560-foot submarine. This is an Ohio class SSGN. Yeah. And so imagine the waves coming where you're in a trough and you hit the trough and the water goes over.
Yeah.
So that's what was going on. And the superstructure right here, actually, you see this notch? In the normal submarine, that's a free flood area. So the water comes in. The sail also is hollow, so the water comes up and pushes the air out. So you got a very small hole. Pressure is force per unit area. Your area is a lot less, so the pressure is freaking through the roof if you're a math type. And so you're literally having to hold on because all that air is coming out. You can't hear yourself think. It's like hurricane force winds trying to eject you out of the cockpit. That's why you're harnessed in, and you're partially submerging every other wave. And it's just and at some point the water got so deep that it was near where the sail was, so the Fairwater planes were. That's when I said, this shit ain't safe.
I mean, is there a fear that you could just nose in and end up?
A little bit, but you're still positively buoyant because you're vents. So that's the other thing. What you don't see here is there's 3 sets of main ballast tanks, and you can Google it. And there's vents on top that open and shut. And the air normally stays in here. You have free flood grates here. So when you have air in here, the water can't come up. Right. Yeah. It's like it put a cup underwater. As soon as you open it, the air has a path to escape, and the water just pushes up and displaces the air out. And that's how the ship sinks and submerges. And then you maintain trim once the ballast tank vents are open. You shut them once you have no more air escaping. They're full of water, and now you're transiting in the water. So to maintain neutral buoyancy, not sink or not come up, you move water in and out of tanks from sea and move them around to create the right moment to trim neutral.
Yeah.
So you want to be at a certain attitude, just going along, hands off your sticks, and be able to do that. That ship was pretty wild. We had some pretty, my first underway, I can't believe I forgot this. My first underway on that ship, we just went out for bay trials. So we where I was stationed in the Pacific Northwest, we were able to leave the pier, go to an instrumented range, and dive the ship in a controlled and operate on a racetrack in a secured range and do a bunch of tests. Without going all the way out to the ocean to do it, and then surface and come back. So basically it was a day cruise. And I remember my first underway, we were going out to do these tests, and it was a rainy, cold day, and we brought this Air Force general on board with his wife. And it was like a Stratcom commander or something like that. That's what it was. And so we had just been recognized from the strategic command for the command's performance the previous year. And so we went out and did this day cruise with the general and his wife and his staff. And back then we used to let guests under the watchful eye of qualified watch standards operate things on watch, like drive the submarine, ooh, this is cool. This is driving the submarine. And there was a qualified watch standard behind that was, supervised to make sure they didn't do anything wrong. So one of the things during that day that was planned was we were going to do what we call an emergency service. So basically it's where you come up and you just put, while you're submerged and you're traveling through the water, you put high pressure air into the ballast tanks quickly to make the ship positively buoyant and pop up quickly. And then what I didn't know was at the time there was a picket boat waiting for us at a certain time to take a picture of the submarine coming out of the water. And we were going to give a picture to the general, like, hey, cool.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, so the general's wife was at the controls to operate these 2 high pressure air valves. And she was given very clear direction, I was told. I wasn't up there for this. I was down below out of the way because I'm a lowly, butter bar, and basically told not to be around any of the VIPs. So I roger that. I'm low level nothing. I'll stay away. And so I knew we were going to do this because we'd been briefed on it. And so when we do an emergency blow, there's 3 blasts of an alarm, diving alarm. If you hear 3 blasts, that means we're emergency surfacing. Well, anyways, this lady, goes to do it, and she only gets the aft group. So the aft group of ballast tanks gets there, and she forgets the forward one, or couldn't get the forward one to operate in time. And so instead of an up angle forming, which is the normal response, we start getting a down angle, and we reach 6 degrees, 7 degrees, some kind of down angle. It's pretty noticeable. I'm looking at my buddy, and we're in this space, and this isn't normal. And we're, and we come out of the water freaking backwards. So when the picket boat took the picture, imagine this, 560-foot submarine. All you see is the stern. You have mountains in the background, stern of the submarine coming out of the water. And that's literally what happened. No. And I'm like, holy cow. I'm like, so this is what my next 3 years are going to be like. That was great. My first impression. Yeah. I'm like, so this is what, I'm like, I went from college to doing this suddenly. I'm like, that's going to be a pretty wild ride, man.
How about, obviously people who have seen the movies with subs, they see these moments where everybody has to be very quiet and somebody's listening. You don't want to make any noise. Mm-hmm. Does that still happen? Is that for real?
Yeah, I think it's more disciplined. I think, in general, it's not as suspenseful as in the movies because, sound transmits different ways, right? You can either, you can just make noise and air, sound propagates through the air. You can also have contact to contact, right? So if you take a hammer and hit a nail, that sound is direct metal to metal, so it's conduction of sound, right? And then sound can radiate through a structure out into the water, right? So there's different ways that noise can propagate out in the water. Modern submarines, we're running fans all the time. We're running pumps. You have to run certain things to keep operating. So you're always making noise. The key is you want to dampen that sound as much as possible. So I think the movie's exaggerated, but we have different quieting conditions. Absolutely.
Interesting.
But it's not as dramatic as, the movies put it. Yeah, I love the movies, how they ramp up. It's a great opportunity, especially with the nice tense music and the silence and the people look on their faces with sweat running down. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Same thing when we're flying, like in an engagement, there's no music playing in the background and cool suspense cuts. It's just the moment. It's a lot less cool. I was wondering, as you're out there, I got to imagine, maybe outside of a training environment, but you're deployed somewhere. You probably have to be mindful of other enemy subs that might be looking for you, or ships, maybe not subs or ships, but that's got to, I assume, just a part of this lifestyle, being out there and cognizant of who else is out there, and do they want you to know? Do you want them to know? Maybe there's times where you do and you don't. How do you navigate that as the captain, I guess, for the times where you were in charge?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things, of course, I'll use just any military unit. If you're going to deploy, if you're going to forward deploy from your normal operating base, to say CENTCOM or, to EUCOM or wherever in the world, you're going to, before you deploy, you're going to get, intel training. You're going to get, you're going to get trained up to operate and certify. I would assume the Army does the same thing. We do workups. So you work up to operate in the AO that you're going to be tasked and deployed to go do. So, we prepare for what we expect in that theater. Or if we're going through multiple theaters to get somewhere, what are the things do we expect? So what are the choke points we're going to transit? What are the, what are some of the bottom features that, we're going to have to encounter that are acoustically challenging? If there's any adversaries that could be in the area or have been known to operate, what do they look like? So for example, if you operate in, near the Arabian Gulf or in the Arabian Gulf, you got to train to operate with multinational forces. It's not just, just one country. It's like 7 or 8 countries. There's lots of countries that turns out have economic interest in the Middle East. And so, when you're out there, you see South Koreans, Japanese, Danish, the UK, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese. You get everyone out there. So it's like a world's playground out there in the Middle East, for example. Or in Europe, you may see NATO vessels. And, it's not just red, bad guys, but it's also allied ships, things that you normally don't see. So you got to, your operators and your teams need to be trained on how to recognize them. What are their capabilities? What threats do they pose? Because blue on blue is just as bad as blue on red. they're equally terrible. You don't want that, right? So you got to train in how to recognize it, how to deal with it, how to maintain stealth. What are our priorities? If we're training, we may deliberately be doing an exercise. So, for example, if we're doing an exercise with, anti-submarine aircraft, typically there'll be a rendezvous. We'll probably go underwater, run some geometry, and they're going to try to track us, friendly exercises. But you still need to recognize there's always a learning component to it. So there's prep work, briefs, debriefs, ARs, using Army terminology on that. So it's a constant training cycle of training your crew to what's expected, in theater or where you're going to be operating. So, it comes down to how do you classify them visually, acoustically, et cetera, et cetera. There's patterns of operation, just like any military op that you would go out and do. It just happens to be in the maritime domain. And, so you can just imagine.
Yeah, everywhere.
I try to put myself in your shoes. If you're deploying the CENTCOM, what would you expect, and what kind of things, what kind of TTP would you practice and employ, against insurgents, and what did we see on the last deployment? As you go through, a training cycle, you have like an NTC or something like that. We have different types of training, so we have something similar. We just deploy, before we deploy, we just spend a bunch of time at sea, off our own coast, doing training and exercises to prepare up.
You mentioned earlier, Rob, this idea of the way you kind of maybe spatially understand where you are relative to everything else that you can't see necessarily with the naked eye, and you described it as an art form. How did you develop it? What is it like once I wouldn't say mastered it. I'm sure you're always building on it, but the people that you see who are great at it, and then over time, I'm sure you're not a captain in a sub because you don't have that. Like, how do you develop that? What's it like?
Yeah. So, I started off in the early 90s, and so the technology is nowhere what it is today. So I would say, as a young officer in the mid 90s, we were using old, 1980s, 1970s technology. So, the key in my mind was, how do I take information off a screen? So basically sound, underwater, we take sound from different directions and you process it in discrete directions. So, in bearings, in headings, you're going a certain heading. Relative to that heading, how do you display acoustic information coming in? And then based on that, imagine as you go through in time, you're checking, the bearing could be changing. Imagine merging onto a freeway. If you're going faster than a car that's merging on, they're going to be drawing aft from you. Their bearings are going to continue to draw aft of you. Or if they're faster than you, they're going to draw ahead of you. It's similar. You're just, the big challenge is, how do you develop a God's eye view of the tactical picture looking at a linear display? So that in itself takes some art. And then, how do you take that information? You can demodulate the noise. Anything man-made has, certain, especially rotating machinery, screws in particular, are imperfect. So you can count the number of propellers, number of blades, and how fast it's going. And if you assume turns per knot, for example, you can estimate speed. So now you're trying to take acoustic information, bearing information, rate information, and trying to form what each thing that you think is out there that you can detect is out there. And you're trying to form a tactical picture in your head. So there's an art to doing that quickly. And, there's certain calculations, thumb rules. You got to be able to eyeball things quickly. And the art is to be able to quickly do that, build a picture. Because those are the building blocks for eventually getting to a point where you shoot torpedoes, right? Because some of those targets, some of those contacts out there, you may get tasked one day to go shoot a torpedo at. So you need to be able to position the submarine at the same time, understand the tactical picture, and build it, and do it with minimal assistance from electronic devices. And you got to be able to make instinctive decisions, because it takes, frankly, a 19,000 ton submarine is not going to turn on a dime.
No, yeah.
An attack submarine, even a 6,000 ton submarine is not going to turn on a dime. It'll turn a lot quicker, but it still takes time. And so, there's, after you become proficient, if you do any motorcycle riding, a good book, I used to ride sport bikes, and a great book that taught me how to safely ride a sport bike was a book by a guy named Keith Code called Twist of the Wrist. And in that book, he equates mental bandwidth of a rider to a dollar bill. When you're first learning to ride a motorcycle, you spend like 90 cents of that dollar, just learning how to shift, how to operate it, how to keep your balance and run the motorcycle. But as you get more proficient, you're only using like 20 cents on the dollar just to do the basic things. And you have 80 cents of your bandwidth to do other things like finding the right line to approach a curve or when to accelerate and decelerate, et cetera. It's very similar to submarining, or I would say flying, as you get more experience. I would say like flying a helo. I'm sure when you started flying helos, you couldn't maintain a 3-foot hover without rotating around.
Good Lord.
No. Yeah, exactly. And so as you become proficient, you can do things like hover, move a couple inches, that takes years of reps and sets. And it's very similar to driving a submarine. So there's a building block. You got to first be able to take information that's coming in from the world, process it, build a tactical picture, and then from that, take actionable, make actionable decisions to position the ship. Once you can do that, then you graduate to the next level where, how do I position the ship to be in an optimum firing position and get within weapons envelope, right? So if I'm going to use torpedo, for example, as my method to kill, then I need to be within launch parameters of the weapon, the submarine, and the fuel, right? And then once that happens, am I placed in the right place? Do I shoot? Then what comes next? Well, the enemy gets a boat. At some point, he may come back and he may want to do something to you. So how do you position yourself to get out alive, right? So there's a whole lifetime of learning and doing that. Well, anyways, with the antiquated combat systems of the 1980s, 1970s, and even into the 90s, you spent a lot of your bandwidth just learning how to just building the picture. Today's combat systems are far more advanced and take away a lot of that guesswork. So, that $1 bill now, initially when I was new, I was spending 90 cents of it just learning how to interpret plots and data. The young officer today, he or she only spends probably 50 cents on the dollar, just learning that, because a lot of it's automated now. And I mean, there's still an art to it, don't get me wrong, but they learn quicker because they're smarter, because I think we're just dumber and they're just smarter. And the other thing too is they have systems to help them, so it speeds up the learning curve. And so I can take a young officer who's newly on board, they can get up to speed, and I can start teaching them the things like getting in weapons envelope earlier during their tour. Yeah. Whereas, when I was a junior officer, I started learning that later in my tour, just because, the way the technology was and just the reps and sets required to get to that point. When you have more advanced processing and capability on board, and a lot of that bandwidth is now taken doing other things, you end up having better trained operators, which I think is great. You have a more lethal crew. So as a junior officer in the early 1990s to being a captain in the 2019 timeframe, it's radically different. It was so different tech. Oh, it's so different, but it was great because the officers are far smarter, they're far more capable. They just pick up things so quickly because we've made the systems more intuitive. Yeah. And so from a training perspective, it's great. It allowed me as a captain to focus, to devote my energies more in other things where, I think it was more of a challenge for my predecessors decades ago.
Just really ignorant question here, but I'm just trying to imagine taking a shot underwater, maybe a torpedo against another submarine. I don't know, like, do they have some type of heat signature, or you have to get not just spatially aware, but you have to get the right depth or altitude? I don't know what you would call it when you're under the water, the right altitude, like, so you don't under or overshoot on the target.
Yeah. I mean, in general, it's a 3D battle space. Yeah, I think you characterize it correctly. I mean, it's similar to probably air-to-air combat in that sense, right? Because everybody has an XY coordinate and also a Z coordinate. I think part of it is to solve that problem, you need to have a weapon that takes account uncertainty. So, torpedoes, our torpedoes, enemies' torpedoes have acoustic sentors that are designed to passively and actively use sound to basically register, through logic, take in information, go, is that a valid target? You basically tell the torpedo before it shoots, hey, this is what I think the target's doing. I'm going to put the ship in a certain direction. You tell me, torpedo, that I'm within parameters. If you're not within parameters, the system will give you a big middle finger and tell you, hey, you can't shoot. You're not in parameters, right? Because it's the weapon's smarter than its operators sometimes. No offense against those who I've served with who are smarter than me. But, once you shoot the weapon, the weapon has its own onboard computer And basically, depending on what settings you give it, you give it parameters to go look in the water.
Okay.
And once it achieves, it's kind of like if you think like air-to-air missiles, right?
Yep.
So a heat seeker. And you use that analogy. I would say we're not using heat; we're using sound.
That's what I was wondering. What you would use?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, you use sound. I mean, it's not because, frankly, that's much easier to register because sound is always coming out. You can get a line of bearing the sound, right? So torpedoes are typically acoustic. Unlike World War II torpedoes, which were you just shoot it in a
like
straight
a dumb
line.
bomb. Yeah, kind of.
Correct,
right.
like a dumb bomb, right? So you had to actually do mental calculations based on the cant of the torpedo tubes, based on what you're shooting. It's like skeet shooting. You're leading a target, right?
Yep.
To intercept. You're going this way, and you're trying to, basically have a collision. Your torpedoes, ultimately, if you shoot something like anywhere from skeet shooting to shooting a torpedo, your goal is basically for your bullet to have a collision with the target.
That's right. Yeah.
That's in essence that's all you're really solving. Call that the fire control problem, or basically the skeet shooting problem. It's just underwater, right?
Now, let me ask you this. So I think before we hit record, you had mentioned you'd been on 5 submarines. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's
and
correct.
You're the captain on how many, Rob?
I was captain of 2 of those 5 submarines I served on.
Wow. How stressful was it the first time you're taking a ship out as the captain, if at all?
It wasn't stressful. It's interesting. So first time, the year was 2012, and I had just taken command, and about 2 months in the command, we're getting underway for the first time. And, I remember prior to being a captain, if I was officer deck who happened to be on the bridge when we're getting underway from the pier, I would, when I'm ready to go, I would usually look behind me and tell the captain, captain, ship's ready to get underway. I intend to get the ship underway. And usually he would say, very well, or get the ship underway, or whatever. He'd give me some order, or he would just acknowledge my intention. And I would always look back. And so fast forward to 2012, we're getting ready to get underway, and this officer deck's in front of me, and he looks back behind me and says, "Hey, Captain, ship's ready to get underway. I intend to get underway." I said, "Very well." And instinctivly, I just looked behind me, and I realized no one's behind me. And it just dawned on me at that moment. I'm like, oh, well, crap. I guess that's wow. And it wasn't a stressful feeling. It was like one of the coolest feelings on earth. It's like falling in love the first time. It's just like, it's like, wow, I'm 39 years old, and the government of the United States has put me in charge of, this 160 crew submarine, multi-billion-dollar submarine carrying missiles. And, I'm given tasking to go out to sea. And, it's kind of like you're pinching yourself. You're just like, this is so cool. I don't think, someone much smarter than me once told me the problems of command are a privilege. And I didn't understand that statement until something bad happened in command. It was about a month later. We had a near miss, and that was the first time that the burden of command finally hit me. When I realized that I'm probably a handful of people on board that realize the severity of a near miss. And, then the world comes, then it all became clear to me that everyone's looking at me to come up with a solution. And it's up to me, and when you're underway on a ship or a submarine, it doesn't matter, a vessel at sea, the captain of the ship it's absolute. It's absolute accountability, absolute responsibility from stern to bow.
You look behind and nobody's there. I mean, that is like a very powerful, you are on your own with this crew.
Yeah. Correct. And so, it's up to me to make certain decisions, and it's time for me to freaking lead. And, that's the first time in my adult life, I think I finally really felt and understood the burden of command and the privilege of it. And I learned a lot from that. And it taught me a lot about accountability, ownership. I didn't manage it initially in the way I should have. And, the best just the way I reported it, the way I communicated it off haul to my leadership, I just didn't do a good job doing it. And I let my emotions cloud the method in which I communicated it, which brought into question my judgment. Mm-hmm. And, and invited the best ass chewing I ever got in my entire career. It was in a message. I received a message from my boss, and he sent me this message. And it was the best ass chewing I've ever received in my life. And it was 100%, 110% deserved. I earned every single word of that message. The only difference was he wasn't there personally to light me up. And I needed it. I frankly, that document really was a turning point in my career. It really made me realize the burden of command and what I'm actually paid to do. And if it wasn't for that, I don't think it would have got me in a place to realize what corrections I needed to make as the head of the organization. I think in the ship, I was making decisions. That wasn't necessarily the heart of the issue. It was my command level understanding of the issue, its impacts, and how we got there, and more importantly, my role and how I failed to train my crew that led me to that near miss. And that's the part that I understood it, I thought, but I truly didn't appreciate my responsibility in that.
Yeah.
Truly. I knew I took the lonely walk and looked in the mirror and said, what the hell did I do to get us in this situation? I absolutely did that. But to truly understand my role in the onus on me to make the decisions to do it, the ownership of it, I just failed to communicate that effectively. And that invited quite the ass chewing, which I wholly warranted. And
can you describe
that was great.
What was in that letter? Number one, was that sent just to you, or do other people on the ship see it? It's just to you.
No one else
from your
see
boss.
it because it was encrypted in a way where I'm the only one that could see it. And so I saw it, and I read it, and I read it, and I read it. Basically, it said, "Hey, Rob, hope everything's going great. I read your AAR on this thing, and basically it sucks. It's clear to me, I question your assessment of how you got there. And, the way you wrote it makes it sound like you're abdicating your responsibility. And that's pretty terrible." I'm just paraphrasing. Wow. I'm basically condensing a 2-page ass chewing into about 50 words. And, in essence, I sucked. And I wrote my communication describing how we got there and what happened when I was, in a state where I was emotional. And my piss poor judgment combined with emotion, I broke one of my own rules. I made a decision when, I probably shouldn't have. And I committed to hitting the send button on an email I probably shouldn't have. And, and when you're ultimately accountable for everything, you speak for the entire command. You are the command, Yeah. And so it's nobody else. And so, I didn't appreciate the power of that until I jacked that up. And I, that message I got back, I call it, when you get your butt chewed, I call that a feedback-rich environment. So I entered a feedback-rich environment pretty freaking quickly, and that was from a couple thousand miles away. So it was pretty good, wow. And it was good. I needed that. It was a good calibration. And later I asked for some assistance. I asked for some external help to help me out and just understanding some things on board. And I got help. Whenever you ask for help, you'll get help. And we're from the government. We're here to help. So anyways, it was all good. And it really was a turning point for me as a person and as a leader, because that was the first time in my life where I really had to change to everything. It was all on me, and I needed to, grow up. And I learned a valuable lesson. I learned several valuable lessons from that. And, I'm glad I had a very, my boss was outstanding, classic leader through and through, just, one of the most patient men on earth, and a great teacher. And so, I owe a lot to him. I really do. And he made such a positive difference in my life. And, and that helped me later when I got command a second time. And I remember those lessons. And so, and pay it forward. Everything in life, you pay it forward. And, so I really appreciated that. And, that was a growing up period. And from that point on, things got a lot better.
What did you almost hit, Rob? Just out of curiosity.
It wasn't hitting. We had a near mishap. We'll just say.
Oh, a mishap. Okay, gotcha.
And just near mishap. I wasn't hitting something. It was just a near mishap. But it was bad enough where it warranted me reporting it.
Yeah.
I probably should let management know that we had a near miss, and so we did that, and it's part of life, and. You go through life and the way we look at it is these are learning experiences. There are corporate lessons from this. So, I would say that one of the things I enjoyed about my former occupation was we strive to have a learning culture. So similar to aviation, I use naval aviation as an example. We're similar in that culture where we're open to admitting our problems, one, trying to get to the root of it and understanding what are the underlying causes. So 3, we can make not only our ship better, but other ships in the Navy better. We want to share lessons because that's the only way you're going to learn. You can't live every experience in one unit. So developing the right corporate culture where we share the lessons and learn from each other's mistakes and mishaps and whatnot is integral to running a world-class organization. So, to me, self-reporting, cool, roger that. I own it 110%, and it's nobody in my chain of command. It's me, and that's the price of command. If you don't want to, I use the analogies. Somebody asked me one time, what kind of mindset do you need to be a captain of a ship at sea? And I said, well, I use a football analogy. It's fourth quarter. You have to score a touchdown to win. It's 4th and goal. You're on the 2-yard line. You have no timeouts left, 5 seconds on the clock. If you want to be the person that has the ball every time to try to win the game, I think you have the right mentality to be a captain of a ship.
Yeah.
You can't be the guy running the block. You got to be the guy that wants to win the game and punch it through. I think you got to have that mentality. I think to be a captain of a ship at sea, and it's you got to be willing to win it all and lose it all. Otherwise, don't say the words "I relieve you." Don't take the job.
Yeah,
because that's them's the rules, as they say. And I enjoyed that. And that's the part of command that I found to be rewarding. Is I did it my way. And that was one of the things that motivated me was I get to make decisions and do things. But as I did command, what I learned the most was I learned so much more than everybody else. I had the fortune of learning from some exceptional leaders that work within my chain of command. I got to watch exceptional men and women make great decisions every day and lead. And I learned a lot of leadership from them. And so, seeing it from the perspective where I'm not in the trenches every day, and I got to watch some exceptional people, just do some incredible things. And they went on to do a lot of good things as their own commanding officers later in their careers was super, And so to me, I think the reward of command was not, doing it in my own way. Initially, I think it was like that, but it quickly became, hey, I get to watch some extraordinary people come up with some ingenious solutions to things, And we had things break, where I saw some of the most incredible solutions devised by my sailors, to get things back and running in the middle of the ocean. Those are the triumphs. Those are the things where I watched the team excel, And so to me, I just happened to be, the guy that held the coffee cup that said "Cap." I just happened to be the guy that was, picked to be the figure, the head of the organization. But at the end of the day, it's the people in the trenches that do the work, and my job is to represent them, equip them, train them, and give the best leadership I can for them. Because I would hope if the roles were reversed, they would do it for me.
Yeah,
and and so to me, it's an honor to do those things. And it was a formative, part of my life.
No, it's gotta be.
Yeah. But, it's fun. It's got its moments. I'll tell you, you asked me about, mishaps. This wasn't a mishap. This is a pretty funny story. So I'm the captain. We're transiting. So we're going from point A to point B. We're traveling 15 knots or something like that. So we're moving along, and it's a Saturday, and
submerged.
So submerged. So we're transiting submerged. We're underwater. We're just fat, dumb, and happy, cruising in the middle of the ocean. And I have to go to the bathroom. So I have a stateroom on the ship. The executive officer, the number 2 guy, has a stateroom. And in this submarine, there's basically the head is between our 2 staterooms. So we share a shower and we share a toilet. So I'm in there, doing number 2, just trying to get it over with and get back to work. And suddenly out of nowhere, all the lights and fans go off in the bathroom. It goes dark. And then I can hear an alarm going off above me and then in the level above me, which is the control room. That's interesting. And so the first thing I do is, because I know that in my bathroom, all the lights and fans are powered off of one side of our electrical distribution system. I know my stateroom is powered by the opposite side. So the first thing I do is I reach forward and I open my stateroom door just to make sure the lights are still on. And I open them, I see the lights, so awesome. We didn't lose all electrical power. That's good, because if you lose all electrical power and you're running around at 15 knots, that's generally not a good day. And then you have to do a bunch of other shit, and it's just not it's a sticky situation then.
Sure.
But the good news is for whatever reason, it turned out it was a fault. We had a power fault that ended up dumping half our electric plant that morning, and we recovered from it. But anyways, I was like, good, so we're reliable, we're redundant. This is just somehow we lost half the electric plant. So I secure from doing number 2, and then on my way up to the control room to see what's going on, because the officer deck's on watch, I hear this announcement over the ship announcing circuit that we lost control of our stern planes. So that's that control surface that controls our pitch. Mm-hmm. And at this speed, it also controls our depth also, because it turns out the forward control surface is pretty small, so its lift force is insignificant. So if you think mathematically, these stern planes are much larger. And so at higher speeds, they have way more of a lift force than the little ones. So they become the control surface to control both altitude and attitude, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So it's like elevator on, I'm using the fixed wing aircraft analogy. It's elevator on steroids, right? At a higher speed. Well, anyways, this is our only control surface that makes us go up and down at this point. And I hear this announcement that we have a failure, and there's direction given to take local control of these stern planes. I'm like, what?
So this is a big deal to do this?
Oh, fuck yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah.
You're like, I'm gone for 10 minutes. Yeah.
I'm gone for a couple minutes. I just went to use the bathroom, for God's sakes. And I hear this announcement, like, what is going on? I'm like, so I'm up there and I round the corner and I look at the ship control panel. So this panel where we have 3 operators or 4 operators that manage the ballast systems and drive the submarines. And there's 2 blown fuses on this panel. And I'm like, and we have normal and emergency and backup modes of controlling these planes. So I look at the diving officer and I ask him, hey, did you try the planes in emergency? I just asked a basic question because, if you have a power transient, and so while I was in the head when the lights went off, I heard a thunk and an alarm. And that typically is associated with hydraulic shifted. So something shifted in our control to a different method. And I got, the moment I asked that question, hey, did you test the planes in emergency? You could see it look like, oh shit, I probably should do that. And so they do that and they have control. Hey, we have control. And I look at the officer like, hey, you probably ought to announce not taking local control of the freaking stern planes. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, and I'm like, okay. And then I see the chief of the boat and executive officer. We're all kind of exchanging stares at each other. So we go and huddle and talk. And, it's like, this is a great learning point. We had something happen out of the blue. There's a good learning opportunity, right? People acted on an indication, and this was a situation that wasn't cleanly written in some kind of backup procedure. So you actually had to understand systems and how they interact and look at the indications to diagnose. And this was a good advanced learning topic. So, just out of the blue, a power glitch, while I'm in the middle of me taking a dump causes an event, which, it didn't cause the event, but I just happened to be there.
Yeah.
It just caused a great learning moment. So that was actually a great training with the rest of our ship control teams is, hey, when you have something like this, you need to look at your fault indications. What are your backups before you freak out and do something, frankly, that probably could have caused more problems.
Oh my gosh.
We probably should have control. We had another one. We were on the surface. We were doing sea trials. This is when I was in command of my second submarine. We're out in the middle of nowhere. There's no contacts. There's nothing. It's the middle of the night. And one of the tests that the civilian test director on board wants us to do is take our rudder and go full throw, maximum left, maximum right, in normal, emergency, and locally. And so we haven't locally taken control of the rudder in like freaking 2 years or something. Nobody in the crew's actually done that. And so the order was given to do it. And, just no supervision. Well-intentioned kid who's only done it once in qualification tries to do it, screws it up, and we have no control of the rudder on the surface. And we're going 15 knots on the surface in the middle of the night. And I hear that we lost rudder control. I'm like, okay, I look at the contacts. I'm looking at my tactical strength. We have nobody out there. So it's completely safe. And I call the bridge. I go, hey, Officer Deck, why are you still going 15 knots with no rudder control? And you could hear the pin drop, like, oh, I probably should slow down. It's like, because we hadn't been to sea in 18 months or something like that, 18, 20 months or something like that. And I didn't take over the crew until the ship was more than halfway through the maintenance period. So no one had been at sea for 20 months or something. A lot of rust. At this point.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And, so, we've done a lot of training, but, the training only prepares you for so much. And I just remember, hey, man, why are we still running around with no rudder control? Oh, hey, that's a great point. That's awesome. So we slow down. And, those are the times where, I think you earn your pay as a captain.
Yeah.
You have to be the person that's detached from it going, hey, just ask the leading question. Hey, have you tried emergency control? Hey, why are you still going fast? And those are the parts that I found,
Yeah.
in retrospect to be funny. They weren't funny at the time,
Of
but,
course not.
each of those
Yeah.
had learning points. It's like, why did I fail to train my crew to not recognize that? And, what are we going to do to fix it? First, own it, found the problem, get after it, go figure it out and re-educate everyone and update their software,
Gosh.
and get them going. But yeah, it's a team sport, it's so much fun. It's that kind of stuff that, I really enjoyed. So that story I told you, we were at 400 feet going at 15 knots and we lost control of this surface. And the officer deck wanted someone in the engine room to just take manual control of it instead of trying a backup method. We could easily go this way or this way while we're cruising at 15 knots. I'm like, hey, why don't we make sure we still have positive control of the submarine before we just do something stupid? So that's the backstory behind that. Then the other one was, the people stand watch up here. So at the very top of the cockpit. So when you're on the surface, you have a hatch, you have an access that goes down into the control room, which is right here.
Rob, what was it like when you mentioned in the 90s, no women on board?
Yeah. So, for over 100 years, 108 years, 107 years, we didn't have women as regular crew members on submarines. So it's all men, all male crew. And then my last two submarines, so I was one of the first commanding officers to bring females on board. So I've commanded a submarine with all male crew. The first increment was just bring some officers on board that are women. And then the second increment, which was on my last ship, we actually had women officers and women enlisted sailors.
Yeah.
So we fully integrated on my last ship. Well, all guys, it's just a bunch of guys.
Mm-hmm.
It's just just imagine you and your brothers in a nice, happy 160 crew family, happy dysfunctional nuclear family, and doing stuff. And it's the stuff you would expect basically, in that environment. You bring the ladies on board, it changes the culture a little bit, but I think the women just want to be, they volunteer to serve their country just like the guys. They just want to do their job, and they don't want to be singled out for who they are. And I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to either, to join a group of people. As long as you meet the standard, that's all I cared about.
Yep.
Can you turn a wrench? Can you carry a submersible pump? Can you go through the hatch and do things? Can you maintain a level of fitness to carry people? I think as long as we maintain those standards, and I think, there's always room to improve. I think, my opinion, the Navy's physical fitness test sucks. We should do something like the ACFT. I think all sailors, regardless of their rate, should be able to carry someone their weight in a firefighting ensemble with kit on, 100 yards in a prescribed time. If you can't do that, in my opinion, I don't think you should be physically, or you should be in an operational unit.
Sense. Yeah.
I think the standard is you need to be able to physically carry somebody through a compartment. And if you can't do that, that's the part I don't think that has anything to do with men and women. I think the Navy is missing the mark on fitness standards in that regard. Because to me, if you can't pull a shipmate out of a smoke-filled compartment, you're useless.
Yeah.
Or if you can't carry a 60 or 70 pound object through a hatch, or that's the problem I have. Is I can train a monkey to do planks, go run a mile and a half, and do whatever. That is no measure, in my opinion. So I think the Marine Corps and the Army got it right to have some kind of combat fitness test where you're actually using functional fitness as a benchmark, because that's really what you're graded on the battlefield.
For sure.
Nobody cares if you can run a mile in 8 minutes if you can't drag someone who's just got blown up.
Yeah.
So sure. I would say for sailors, I think there should be a comparable test. And I don't know if we're ever going to get there, which, as a civilian, as a taxpayer now, that's kind of one of the things that I'm.
Where do you blow shit at somebody else on this model?
So when you're in port, let's see, Los Angeles class submarine, it's the left side. So we're moored and we have a line on the port side, but we're moored this way, and we have a line that goes over and onto the pier. And the pier, there's a north-south pier. So imagine a pier, and there's another submarine on this side.
Okay.
That submarine's getting ready to get underway. So one of the things they have to do before they get underway is disconnect all their shore services, including CHT. Right. So instead of the poop, basically it's your poop, your poop line, your sewage line. So you have to disconnect. Well, there's a valve on the pier that they have to shut. So when they flush their line, drain it, they have to carry the hose and they have to shut the valve on the pier because it's a T header. So there's a valve header, our valve, and then there's a pipe that goes all the way to a shore collection facility, if that makes sense. They forgot to shut their valve. We're getting ready to blow our poo tanks, and we don't check their valve because it's not in our procedure to do so. We just assume their valve is shut, or if it's open, their valve is shut. It's not going to, you know what I mean? So they're getting underway, and they had secured everything, but they forgot to shut their valve. As soon as we pressurized their tanks and I gave permission to start blowing, poo goes path of least resistance across the pier, shoots onto the bow of their submarine, is spraying poo on the front of their submarine.
Horrible.
And there's a bunch of crew members on top because they're getting ready to cast off lines. And I hear this announcement on the ship's announcing, just secure blowing sands. I'm like, what the hell? So I run up the hatch. The captain is behind me. I go look, and I'm like, holy shit. There's like a little geyser of poo like on the front of their submarine. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, oh my gosh, they forgot to shut their valve. And the captain goes, did you check our lines before you gave permission? I'm like, yes, sir, I did. And so he walks over, and apparently he wasn't friends with this captain of this other submarine. He goes, hey, Mike, looks like you forgot to shut a valve. Sucks to be you. Have a great underway. He comes back and he goes, yeah, call me if you have any problems. Make sure you shut the valve. Yes, sir. Got it. Like, holy shit.
Man.
We just blew shit all over this other submarine.
We've interviewed a couple, many SEALs, but a couple SDV folks on here. And I remember one of them saying that one of the scariest things they ever did was when they left a sub. Now, I can't remember if it was in an SDV or just, their own person coming out of a sub, but basically,
lockout.
It's just you and the black ocean, basically. And, and you don't know what's below you. It's a very surreal feeling. The way
I bet it is. And so funny story. So when I told you that story, the SEAL catching it. So we do all our workups, our basic. So it's basically a crawl, run, walk approach when we're working up soft. And so we basically start with unopposed daytime conditions, perfect sea state. So we want to make sure that the divers can get the SDV out, the SEALs can get can safely untether, go out, navigate, and come back and do everything without fault. So we basically do unopposed daytime conditions, making sure everybody can do it, right? So we got to pass that first. And then we start doing recoveries. And then our certification standards, we have to do it in complete darkness, so the SEALs, the divers have to do everything in complete darkness, do all the moves to untether and recover the SDV in complete darkness.
It's crazy.
And the SEALs have to be able to drive the SDV, navigate, do their task, and come back in complete darkness. Unopposed is the baseline certification level for an SDV team in a host submarine. And we have to maintain the submarine within parameters, because if we lose depth control with divers on deck, we can incapacitate them super fast. You can kill all the swimmers quickly if you take a deep depth. They can get the bends. Okay. And bends, now the what's it called? The dry dock shelter here, the very forward part is a small decompression chamber, but we can only decompress like 2 people at a time in it. So, if you only have one hangar, that limits the amount of medical space you have. So we have an embarked medical team, the SDV team's embarked. We got a whole bunch of people on board submarine. We're doing soft ops. And, but yeah, you got to keep the submarine at perfect depth in order to recover. So imagine a submarine in the dark, deploying an SDV in the dark, no lights, nothing. Oh, you see a bunch of glow sticks. All you see is a bunch of glow sticks running around. And this SDV goes off, does its thing. They have a coordinate to rendezvous. We have a backup rendezvous point. We'll just say certain communications. Yep. And, they go do their thing, and we have contingency plans on how to recover them. If they're disabled, then we have a way to recover them also. There's a different method, and we have to certify on that. So it's an integrated team. And then an SSGN with no nuclear weapons, we can carry up to 155 Tomahawk cruise missiles. So my last deployment on Georgia, we deployed to the Middle East. We had over 100 cruise missiles and a dry dock shelter, and we're a full up ISR platform. Yeah. So we're able to do, all kinds of stuff. In fact, I did a podcast with David Hookstead. If you look up David Hookstead, I did a podcast with him 2 months ago or a month and a half ago. And he asked me about going through the Strait of Hormuz. And I was tasked to go through the Strait of Hormuz in December of 2020 on the surface. So found out after we got to Bahrain, we made world news, because apparently the day before, we didn't know this, but an Iranian proxy force had attacked a U.S. base in southern Iraq. And the next day we just popped up. We were doing a scheduled show of force through the Strait of Hormuz, the timing wasn't any better, and basically Iranian proxies attack. Next day, 2 cruisers and a guided missile submarine go through the Strait of Hormuz. It's a show of force. It's like,
timing.
It was freaking, and we caught them completely off guard. That was freaking awesome. And, that was one of the highlights of my career. It's like, wow, we get to transit the Strait of Hormuz on surface, and give Iran the finger, So, it was a blast.
I'll bring us to a close here in just a second, Rob. I wanted to just get your thoughts with technology evolving the way it is. How do you think about AI in that domain in submarines and the future there?
Yeah, I think the future, I think AI used correctly can take that $1 bandwidth I talked about. I love that analogy. If we can apply AI correctly in tactical decision making, we can really free up almost, in a perfect world, 80 cents of that dollar bandwidth in an average decision maker with AI. I still think you need to train and invest in first principles. I still think, frankly, you lose the red dot, you still need to be able to shoot iron sight.
That's right.
I think that analogy still applies. I think, maintaining the fundamentals. I think when you get more automated, you need to resist the temptation to go all in on automated. And you still need to retain some backup capability. I think in this world, we rely so much on technology. We have an entire generation of people who've never had to do things manually. And in most situations, they don't have to. But, there's an EMP attack or you lose power, how are you going to be able to still safely navigate and do stuff? I think there still has to be, I think AI is the future. I think if we can employ AI correctly to better ascertain and quickly ascertain, probably from a probability standpoint, what the likely enemy action is, I think you can apply AI in, combat arms type application. And especially, I think, in the field on land and also at sea. And so I see a bright future.
Would you expect to see in the near future, like an autonomous type, maybe even controlled, so maybe not AI, but remotely operated like a drone sub of that size without humans on board, I suppose?
Yeah, I think, you see the war in Ukraine and you see what's happening in the, in the air domain. I think humans are quickly, fighter pilots are becoming a thing of the past. I think the modern drone is really the future, and I think, manned flight is going to become less and less, closer to the enemy, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I think in the undersea domain, you're seeing that also. I think you're going to see the submarine's purpose change, I think, as time goes on. It's going to go from being something that's up close and personal and something that's probably more remote, like a sea base, in an AI world where you have expendable vehicles. Because really, you see it in Ukraine. Drones, the kill ratio, the drones just fly to the human and blow up. Yep. And we've gone from it being an abstract concept in professional magazines to instantly being deployed in the field within 3 years. And in Moore's law, I saw a graph a week ago that showed a logarithmic vertical scale of, computation per some unit and time on the horizontal axis. And it's basically a linear line on a logarithmic scale. Moore's law is well and alive in the computational world. I would not be surprised that, it's the same with drones undersea or above land.
Yeah.
So that's the future. That's just me, Joe Taxpayer now, just seeing where things are going.
You've seen it evolve.
I've seen it evolve. And, I think there was recently a news release that talked about a large undersea vehicle, prototyping. And I'm like, that's cool. Yeah. I think the way we use the submarine as a vehicle, just like aircraft, is fundamentally changing in this century. And, I think it'll be for the good. And, the submarine force that is of the future is not the force I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And, it was fun. I enjoyed it. I encourage young men and women to join the military and serve their country. It's one of the most noble things you can do. In the Navy, we make better people. And, the most rewarding thing of my career was to see young men and women from all walks of life come together and achieve something greater than themselves. I think you ask anybody who served in the military, who served in for a while, they see that. That's probably a common thread.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And, the leadership opportunities and life lessons were just incredible, and I stayed in for the people. I didn't stay in for being sleep deprived and breathing shitty air for months on end.
And being away from family for God knows how long.
And spending a bunch of time, away from home, in that environment. So, just like, anybody in other services who are deployed from their families. So, it's a sacrifice, and, you pay a price for it. But, in the end, anybody that's raised their right hand and took the oath knows that sacrifice. And, my hat's off to them. I just had the fortune and honor to be there and, just witness a lot of it.
Yeah, I'm going to round out on 2 questions here, quick ones I ask everybody. One of them is there anything you carried with you when you were kind of underway out to sea, whether in your ship, like in your stateroom or on your person, that had sentimental value, good luck charm, or something you just wanted nearby?
Yeah, so my kids got me they got me this little Lego like Boba Fett. And I carried that thing around on, I didn't carry it on my person, but I brought it to sea with me. They bought me this little Lego figure a couple of years back, and I kept it while I was on there. The other one is I kept the book Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. I read that. I found that book to be really, really insightful. When I was having a not so good day, or I just needed time to recognize that it's not about me. It's 100% about the work and the service, and and the biggest thing for me was remind myself periodically that don't expend any energy over things you have no control over. It's not worth it. And, for me personally, during those times, I had to fight that temptation a lot. And it's part of growing up, but it's also you recognizing that there's a different way of thinking. And, and I continue to read it.
My senior in high school has it by his bedside. So love that book.
Nice. And as I've gotten older, I think the other book that I neglected earlier in my life is the Bible. That's the other thing I neglected. And it blew me away all these years. I didn't really read it and appreciate the wisdom it has in it in God's word. And if that probably would have helped me out a lot if I was back in my 20s and had my act together. So I think, put those together. I think that would have helped me out. And, we all learn in life, you got to choose your own paths.
Mm-hmm. And then, actually, I'm going to slip one more in here. Like, what do the movies get wrong about the submarine lifestyle community experience? Or what do they get right also?
I hate submarine movies. I think the best submarine movie is Das Boot by Wolfgang Petersen. It's not a happy ending, and it frankly describes submarine culture. It's, you go for the target, you take risks, you bold but not reckless. And, that's where it gets it right. I think where it gets it wrong is it tries to glamorize, like your Jonesies and all these people. Yeah, sure, you have some star players, but, it's not as colorful as people make it out to be. In fact, you're doing your job if it's boring. If it gets exciting, then things aren't going well. Yeah. I think a lot of people, I would say that about flying too. It's usually, if it's exciting, it's probably not good. Yeah.
We would say that at the agency when you're out. Like if you're really having to sprint on a surveillance route, things have gone south effectively.
Yeah. I mean, if you rehearse, you have assumptions, you plan it. If you execute it to plan, it should work a certain way. And when it doesn't, that's when things go. Things get interesting and spicy.
Okay. Dalspin. All right, I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah.
And then
it's a good movie. World War II movie.
Last question here is, I think I know the answer from the way you described it, but just looking back on almost 30 years in uniform, a lot of time away from home, a lot of close calls, a lot of learnings. As you look back on that time, would you do it again?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. I'd do it all over again. Service is, I think you and I and everybody else join the military for a reason. I think we stay in the organization for a different reason, and it gave me purpose. It gave me a mission. I stayed in it for the people, the best people I've ever met in my life and worked for that I'm willing to give up my life for, I don't think I would have found that working in a cubicle.
Yeah.
And, to me, the sense of purpose and knowing that despite how much it could suck at times, that you're bonded by it, there's purpose. And, as a person, I kept engaged and it was rewarding. That I'd do it again. Absolutely.
Rob, thanks for the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, it's been a pleasure. Hope you had got some things out of it. I'm happy to, if you have any questions afterwards, happy to answer.
I hope you enjoyed that combat story. Definitely our first submariner to have on the show. Super interesting experience. I can't even imagine what it's like being underwater that long for those stretches and tight spaces. I don't know. It takes a very special person to do. Just a couple listener comments I wanted to share. The first is from @Ty Sobel about the Rob Sarver interview. Rob, as you recall, was a Navy SEAL officer, had 7 deployments, and worked on the Warrior to Civilian book. Had another great interview. Huge thanks to both of you for sharing these stories. And then another one here, and this is E5 SEF USAR, Sef Usar. And this is on the Daryl second round interview. Thanks for a great interview at Combat Story, Ryan. I was an Iraqi interpreter, U.S. Army soldier, and now a veteran working in cybersecurity. So whoever you are, you should reach out to me. That sounds like an interesting story right there. And I will tell you straight up, I appreciate your service, as I'm sure all the people listening do. Not easy to make that path. So with that, you can check out our newsletter at combatstory.com/newsletter. I hope wherever you are in the world, you're having a great rest of your day, your week, your weekend. And as always, stay safe.